Welcome to the Global Initiative for Digital Empowerment, or GUIDE. I am Paul Toomey, a co-chair, and welcome to our YouTube channel. What you're about to see is a presentation by Dennis Snower, my co-chair, and myself, both about GUIDE and about the analysis and proposals that we've been working through for the last several years on what we call the Innovation for the Digital Economy Architecture, or IDEA. So, here is GUIDE's IDEA. GUIDE is a non-partisan international non-profit organisation, and it's been founded to give people a voice and control over their data. It is a group of about 140 people around the world who've come and joined over time. Members is basically people who wish to be involved in discussion. The key thing about the group is that they are largely from all manner of backgrounds. And I can see a lot of you on the screens here, so you know each other, but people from backgrounds in research, people from backgrounds in running policy and chief of staff to mayors and potential presidents and others. We've got now ministers in parts of Africa who are members. But then we've got people who've run networks, people who've run online businesses, people who've been diplomats, people who have been experts in cybersecurity, etc. A lot of lawyers and others who are part of this initiative. And we've been helped in the past by people like the New Institute and the Global Solutions. We have been working on the ideas that we're about to share now for quite a period of time, and launched our first report on this in 2022. And in a period between 22 and 24, spent a lot of time in discussions, particularly in Brussels, about what this would mean in the European context. So with the DGs, Connect, Justice, Consumers, a lot of MEPs, government officials, etc. In June last year, we launched a sort of version 2 of the thinking, and we'll share some of that today, particularly in the context in Europe with the release of the new omnibus legislation coming out and the new thinking in Europe. We've also been responding to that. We'll have research papers we can share with this community very shortly. Now pass to Dennis.
Okay, I think the basic idea can be discussed very quickly, which is in normal economic markets, you have from consumers, and you've got the suppliers supply services and the consumers pay for them. And that is the standard digital trade model that most people have in their minds. And that's above ground, like this tree, the part that you can see, the payment for the services and the services that are received. Similarly, the digital economy interacts with the rest of the economy, and there's also payment for products. The advertising industry is similar. There you've got people who recognize influencers, that is, people who recognize as advertisers, and they want to influence the service providers, and they pay in order to advertise, and they get a service in return. So that's also completely above ground. So e-commerce and advertising is both above ground, and then underground, you have the digital consumers receiving digital services largely either for free or grossly underpriced, giving up personal information usually without informed consent, and receiving influence usually beneath conscious awareness by what appears on their screen. That is not a market. And this is where the rot sets in, because this is a form of barter, digital barter. And I think what you need to have in the back of your mind is we had a system like this in labor markets. Under feudalism, you had indentured servitude, slavery, and so on. There, people received some housing and protection for free, and often food. And in return, they gave up labor, and that was barter. When we moved from there to to labor markets where people could sell their labor services, that released a huge amount of economic activity. There's something similar that could happen here if this digital barter were to give way to standard economic markets. But let's move on to the next slide. There you see how this is financed. You have subversive influences that people don't know about, and they pay for information they receive. but that information was received without informed consent and usually not even within conscious awareness. And so you have three markets where people are paying, but one critical market will sell something that ought to be a market. It's digital barter. And that gives rise to all sorts of problems, some privacy problems, security, manipulation, and so on and so forth. So if we move on to the next slide. So this information is harvested. You can call this digital horticulture, that people are being used, enticed in order for the information about them to be harvested and then sold to subversive and other influencers and other producers. And so that basically subverts the entire market. And this we see as the central problem. So if you could turn this into a market with all the provisos that normal markets have, we have markets for all sorts of goods, also for public goods. And in these markets, there needs to be some equality of information and equality of market power. The absence of this market gives rise to all these problems that I talked about. But the one that is usually overlooked is markets are being undermined. Because you don't have a market where all the other markets are being undermined. In addition to the things that people always complain about, undermining democracies, social cohesion is undermined, exploits psychological weaknesses, creates huge inequities in the economic and political and social spheres and so on. The fact that it is an extremely inefficient system, as barter always is, and because it happens to come at a time of the digital revolution where there's huge technological advances, people do not see the inefficiencies. They're just impressed by the technological advances. And it's similar, I think, to the early industrial revolution, where we saw huge technological advances, steam engine, spinning jenny, etc. And that came with debtors' prisons and factories, child labor, and so on. And people thought that these governance frameworks were part and parcel of the technological change, but they're not. And something similar is going on here. So the current approach is to deal with all the symptoms, the problems of competition, privacy, hate speech, consumer rights, business practices, and to deal with each of them separately. And so that's looking at debtors' prisons and child labor and saying the children need to be treated more humanely, and prison people shouldn't go to prison for debts without recourse, and so on and so forth. And by looking at the symptoms, you don't achieve the result. The result that we want is empowering digital consumers to get control over their personal data within obviously standard legal constraints, and to use that control to sell their data where they wish to partake in markets, give the data away where they don't, or exchange it in kind, but at least have some parity with the digital service providers. And that can only be done through representatives.
Thank you, Dennis. One of the things that I've always found resonates for me in this dialogue we've had as a community is, in part of my previous life, I was the senior official in Australia for all information economy issues and had to take things through cabinet and through parliament. And so the point that Dennis was just making about dealing with the symptoms and doing them through legislation, I know how hard it is to get something through parliament. I know how much work needs to be taking place. And so I don't think we're against at all the idea of the role of the state and the role for legislation and rules and rights applying to markets. That's what modern markets require. At the same time, having the polity, having the citizens expect that all these problems they see through the modern digital economy should be fixed by government and government alone, if that's their model, is basically a hiding to nothing, in the sense that it's such a drain upon the political process and a drain upon the constant catch-up. And you've even seen that again in Brussels. You've seen the sort of reaction a little bit about some of that now, talking about simplification, etc. So one of the key aspects of making things simpler at the national and international public policy side is where can we rely on markets to achieve a lot of these objectives and address a lot of those concerns in a way that then there is a role for the state, but that role is clearer and somewhat simpler. And we've seen a lot of that in physical goods and physical good markets. Why can't we see the same thing now in data markets? So some of the ways forward that we've thought this through are, first of all, you do have to ensure that citizens, or at least residents, can have control over their personal data and who has access to it. And why is that important? Because you can't have a market around data if people don't have some way of saying yes or no to access to it. And secondly, they need to have transparency where it's being used. Dennis talked earlier about just the vast amounts of data being harvested, and many of us know, but what many of us don't know is where that data ends up and where it gets shifted to and who else gets it and how it gets used. And it's not only lack of transparency what data gets harvested in the first interaction, there's no transparency at all what happens to the data over the lifetime. So that's the first point we say is very important. Secondly, citizens should have the ability to negotiate the terms under which that data gets used. They have the rights to do that in terms of how their labour gets used. They have the terms in terms of how their image gets used, a lot in simple terms often. But how do you do it in terms of the ability to negotiate the terms under which that data gets used? And to do that, you have to have some degree of responsibility on the consumer to ensure that what we call key personal data, the sort of data that would be involved in any initial contractual reaction, the sort of thing governments try to collect for various purposes, the things that get a business process started, so not so much the inferred data about people, but the accurate data, something that can be authenticated by a third party. Consumers really should have an obligation in there to make certain that data is authenticated and is accurate. And there's all sorts of parts of the market where that happens now. The domain name system is a good example. If you go to get a domain name, you're actually required to update your information about that domain name every 12 months with your registrar because there's know your customer requirements, etc., and intellectual property protection issues within the domain name system. So that's a good example of where we have lots of examples in the market where people are required to keep data accurate. So the ability for consumers to do that, I think, is not only important for their ability to negotiate its access, it also gives a huge boon to the economy as a whole, especially to business, in being able to counter fraud. To the ability then to negotiate in a world where we have massive corporations and individuals interacting with them, I think what the experience has been, you can have all the rights in the world and the rights are very important, but if you haven't got some practical mechanism whereby you get some scale to negotiate and get some change, you're in a very difficult situation. And so we think that one of the key things that needs to be married to the rights of who data and how it gets accessed is they've got to have the rights of association and representation to be able to achieve two things. One, some scale in negotiation. And secondly, then to have access to skilled professionals who can actually come and tell them how those data markets work and give them advice as to what would be good and not to be good. And that we've seen examples of this in other industries, and particularly the rise of the financial services industries. Advice around savings for retirement is an example where there's a whole body of people that move in various parts of the world who are your representative, they are your fiduciary. They give you the advice as to how those markets work and how you would make your decisions about your needs. And so the rights of association and the rights of access to skilled professionals as representatives, we see as a key part of making this market move more into balance of power. We also think that what's important as well is that there should be fiduciary obligations on data operators, people who are data aggregators, that data should be used in the best interest of data subjects. We've had for hundreds of years in the offline world that sort of responsibility where there's an asymmetry of power between somebody who collects data on an individual and somebody who uses it. Doctor, patient, psychiatrist, rabbi and a member of the synagogue, civil servants and citizens, where if there is an asymmetry, the basic rule has been the data should be used in the best interest of the data subject. And there's lots of examples around the world of those sort of instances. We're saying the same things really should apply online. But importantly, if you're able to negotiate and you come to an agreement with someone about the use of data, that should be the evidence that the other side has actually met that fiduciary obligation. So we think there should be an incentive to say to the data markets, the data aggregators in particular, you either can be held accountable for fiduciary obligation and the best interest of the data subjects in front of the courts, or You can negotiate directly, you can agree terms, and the fact that you've got those terms will be seen as de facto you've met the fiduciary obligation. So that's part of the model. And sitting within that also is the role of data commons and the importance of data commons. Now, Dennis, perhaps we've got that here now as key things, but you've summarized that recently as a series of key pillars. Perhaps you could talk to that briefly before we go to the next page.
There are four key pillars that become actionable if one takes these provisos seriously. The first is giving consumers control over key personal data in ways that Paul has noted. The second is collective representation by expert fiduciaries. The third is imposing fiduciary duties on these expert fiduciaries. And the fourth is collective negotiation. And that means it has a number of implications. First of all, there needs to be accreditation of the fiduciaries, so that works well. The key personal data needs to put in repositories, and those repositories need to be audited. And the collective negotiation as evidence of compliance with these fiduciary duties, that needs to be a process that is transparent. And then there needs to be standardization in markets so that there are uniform fiduciary duties, interoperable data formats, and auditing frameworks. All of this exists in one way or another in the offline market and to some degree in the online as well. But this would help streamline the whole process and integrate it along common set of principles. And I think that's to be kept in mind. And that is what would lead, I think, to simplification of regulations. It would also lead to much more accountability and trust, much more democratic legitimacy. And by making the allocation of resources more efficient through these negotiations, which avoid asymmetries of information and power, they would promote immeasurably innovation and growth. So the four pillars are control over key personal data, collective representation by key expert fiduciaries, imposing fiduciary duties on them, and collective negotiation.
And perhaps I'll share now a few more slides, but I'll go through them very quickly, where we talk about the fact that this will then potentially result in a form of an ecosystem where we expect the consumer plays a role, the fiduciary advisor plays a role. There is a place where the data itself is held, and we call that a data registry. We are neutral about where those data registries are. In some markets, the economics has rewarded large data, specialized large iron that manages this. In other places, there's a lot of emphasis for political and other reasons about distribution. So this could be all distributed and actually controlled out of your phone. And we don't take a position on that. We just think that the key thing about the data repositories is that the transfer then to the businesses and others interacting needs to be exceptionally speedy. It needs to be the sort of machine-to-machine coded interactions that allow lots of the e-commerce environment to work now, such that this is not an environment where people are sitting there clicking their phone saying, yes, or I agree to this cookie, or I don't agree to this cookie. It's not that sort of interaction. This is, I think about this once a year. I talk to my fiduciary advisor. We come to decisions about what sort of mixes of data I'd like to share and what circumstances with what sort of people. It gets put into code sitting on my repository. And then the digital economy interacts with my profile that I have established. It knows what the rules are. It makes the transfers. It operates under smart contracts. And all of this happens in a very quick way. It's the way in which much of the share market systems work, the banking systems work, the travel agencies and the travel systems work. This isn't new stuff, but it is bringing a new way of taking those sort of rules and bringing it into a new aspect. And as I said here, there's multiple technologies that exist to support these data flows, and we don't think policymakers need to decide it. In Europe, and it's just a small example, there are quite a number of players who are involved in this already. And so it's just pointing out that there's an activity here already in the European space. And indeed, we'll be hearing from one of these intermediaries, fair is fair, in our next seminar. Many people could be involved as intermediaries. And so just to give it an example, again, in Europe, just to give it, but it's be true in any other market, lots of people who are presently playing the role of giving advice to consumers who've got large-scale systems from the telcos through to collection agencies to domain name registrar, etc. All of these sorts of relationships and that sort of role of giving advice to their customer base, who could well find that extending that capability is something naturally they could do. So this innovation of it, who could be involved, how it would work, who would find this attractive, we think there's many aspects here that would generate new business opportunities to really work towards this alignment of markets and incentives. You might say, what's the point of sharing information and data, and how does that work? To come to Dennis's point about you create new innovation and new growth when you have markets, look at what's happening in the commercial environment now. In the commercial environment, in businesses, the impact of agentic AI, where businesses are taking their own data and using AI to find more ways of getting value out of that data, you can find indicators of where that value can be captured now and is being reckoned. One of the good cases, again, in Europe, is the software company SAP, which has got a very extensive program on agentic AI in its business base. And if you were to look at its share price, it is a great indication, and you listen to the reports in their annual reports, the growth for SAP has all come from being able to bring this agentic AI down into its customer base and leverage the records they have. And so you can just see in the market value of one company in Europe, this is an indication of the value of data. And if this is the case for businesses, it could well be the case for individuals. But we've got no way of measuring it at the moment because we don't have a market. We've got a barter system. One of our members is an ethicist, Simon Longstaff, who makes an important point, I think, looking forward. As the economic value of labour is reduced due to robotics, etc., there is going to be a shift to asserting equivalent economic value of personal information. Once personal rights associated with data shift from being privacy rights to economic rights, democratic governments will find it impossible to resist the pressure from their citizens to give legal effects to those rights. So we think a lot of what we're seeing, and people say, what does this mean about AI and robotics, etc.? At some macro level, it means consumers are going to be focusing more upon where's the value for them in such an automated environment. So we'll finish there now. We'll share some emails if people want to follow up on that.